Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's version of Inside Out. I did want to mention that coming up for the next installation of Inside Out, we have the River and Rail, the Industrial Evolution of the Port of New Bedford. That's going to be displayed from September 17th through September 30th. And Michael Dyer, our colleague, will be doing a presentation on that on September 22nd. The exhibit that you're going to hear about tonight, called A Moment in Time, was installed this morning, and it will be on display on the museum's plaza until September 16th. And we may, who knows, we may even add another installation of Inside Out after Michael's is done. So our presenter tonight is Emma Rocha, who is the museum's curatorial assistant, and she has been curatorial assistant since August of last year, just a few months after graduating from Johns Hopkins University with a Bachelor of Arts in the History of Art. But Emma has held several curatorial roles since she finished her sophomore year of high school in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. I don't know that I was ever destined to work in a museum, but it seems like Emma certainly was. So Emma has searched through our extensive photo archives, and being a regional history museum, we have a very large photo archive of things regional, local, and even some global. And she's found some engaging and interesting photos, and then has dedicated several hours to adding context and historical tidbits to these photos. And apparently this includes interesting information about squirrels. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Emma, and I'm going to go on mute, and you're not going to get to look at me anymore. Emma, all yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen with you now so you can see the PowerPoint. Oh, and that's blocking. There we go. So thank you so much for joining me for my talk tonight on my exhibit, A Moment in Time, which is part of the Whaling Museum's exhibit series, Inside Out. You can visit the exhibit on the museum's plaza now. It'll be up for the next 2 weeks. The museum has an extensive photograph collection which contains some fascinating historical photos. I want to share some of the photos which most interest me and which I feel present a snapshot of life in the past, hence a moment in time. Most of these photographs were taken locally in the Old Dartmouth region, that is Dartmouth, New Bedford, Fairhaven, Acushnet, and Westport. A few of the photographs I will present in this talk were taken outside the region, but they were taken by local photographers. One of the elements of my exhibition is that rather than list the year of the photograph on the label, I provide the visitor with information to help them guess when the photograph was taken. There is also an answer panel included in the exhibit. I'm not able to make guessing a year a feature on the Zoom presentation, so the years of the photos will be listed on the slides. I'm going to present the photos in chronological order and discuss the historic context for each, which will allow me to share with you a variety of interesting things that I found while doing research for this exhibit. Hopefully, you will find it interesting too. Let's get started. This first photograph is one of the oldest photos that I came across in our collections. The daguerreotype was taken around 1845, and the man in the photo has been identified as Hingham clockmaker Joshua Wilde, who was also a Quaker. He was born in Hingham in 1786, and he died in Scituate in 1860. He was the first clockmaker living and working in Hingham, and so he had a ready customer base, and he became a very talented and successful clockmaker in the city. He was also active in his local society of friends, and he became known in the town as the Old Quaker. In the 19th century, most Quakers wore plain dress because they adhered to a testimony of simplicity, and they believed that resources such as time and money should be used to improve one's own life and that of others, rather than focusing on the quality of goods they owned or on their own wealth. This may explain why he appears to be wearing a beaver fur top hat, which was out of style by 1845. Top hats themselves were still very much in style, and the mark of a well-respected and well-to-do gentleman, which is probably why he owned one and decided to wear one for his portrait. However, felt top hats made of beaver fur went out of fashion in the 1830s, at which point the fashionable material for top hats became silk. So it is likely that he purchased this top hat many years earlier when beaver fur was fashionable and much more common, and later decided not to be very focused on fashion and just keep the one he already had. Or, of course, he might have just liked the way it felt over silk. Beaver fur top, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to switch the slides there. Beaver fur top hats were fashionable from the late 1700s to the 1830s, which of course raised the price of beaver fur and depleted their population. You've probably heard the phrase mad as a hatter, which came about because of the mercury poisoning milliners or hat makers would often get. Beaver felt top hats were partly to blame for this, as after the underlayer of fur was separated from its outer guard hairs, it was soaked in a mercury solution to remove any remaining barbs. And then when that was done, the fur was pounded into felt and shaped into a hat. Beaver fur was preferred over other furs like rabbit fur because it held up much better in the rain. Silk, luckily for the beavers, although also probably because of their declining populations, became more fashionable for top hats in the 1830s. Popularity of top hats and their increasing height in the 1800s necessitated an interesting invention. This is the spring-loaded top hat. I don't think that's what he's wearing, because it was invented by Antoine Gibus, a Frenchman, in order to solve the problem of top hats at the theater and the opera, blocking the view of the person behind the wearer. Spring-loaded top hats were collapsible. In fact, we have an example of one in the museum's collection. This next photograph was taken by the New Bedford photographer Stephen F. Adams. It shows a man standing on a sidewalk by an unpaved road on the corner of County and Court Streets in New Bedford. The photograph was taken around 1870. The man's outfit reflects the time period, as we can see it is much more formal than what is worn today. He is wearing a pocket watch, vest, hat, and jacket. Hats were common for everyday wear for both men and women up through the 1950s. The identity of the man in the photo is unknown. Unpaved streets like the one seen here were common at this time, when the main form of long-distance travel across lands was railroads. It was cyclists, not automobilists as one might think, who were the first to push for paved roads in the United States. They started to lobby the government for paved roads in the 1880s with their Good Roads movement. The Office of Road Inquiry, which later became the Federal Highway Administration, was formed in the 1890s, in part because of the push by the cyclists. So we do have them to thank for our paved roads. And while we do often have potholes, especially in New Bedford, I can't imagine how difficult it would be to constantly be driving on unpaved roads. I will talk more about transportation in 19th century New Bedford soon. But first, let's discuss old-fashioned firefighting. This photograph was taken by the local artist Clement Nye Swift in 1887. It shows the old No. 9 hand engine in Acushnet. Hand pumps used to fight fires had been around for a few hundred years before this photograph was taken. One of the first in America was used in Boston in 1653, so the city had made moves to combat fire as early as 1631, when they outlawed thatched roofs and wooden chimneys. Wooden chimneys just sounds like a pretty bad idea to me. The first fire engine company in America was also located in Boston and was founded in 1678. The history of firefighting has a connection to whaling, as one of Boston's fire wards, Thomas Melville, who held that position from 1779 to 1825, was the grandfather of Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick. His great-grandfather, Allen Melville, was also a firefighter in Boston, from 1733 to 1761. The hand pump fire engine seen in this photograph would have had a reservoir for water and was movable by human or animal power. It could have been kept filled by a bucket brigade, although the hose and the pumps on this one may have used it to fill up with water from a nearby lake, and the Acushnet has many lakes. This was a method used to fill hand pumps since at least the 1700s. The steam-powered pump or fire engine was introduced a few decades prior to when this photograph was taken, though it is unclear if this is one. It is unlikely because many used horses for propulsion and they were mainly used in larger cities, neither of which is the case in this photograph. Motorized pumpers were not invented until the 20th century, so it's definitely not one of those. Okay, back to New Bedford transportation in the 19th century as promised. This photo, like the previous one, was also taken by Clement I. Swift. It dates to June 2nd of 1888 and shows horses drawing a carriage seen from Lund's Corner. While there were extremely few automobiles in use at the time when this photo was taken, they would start to be used along with horses and carriages within the next couple of decades. However, public transportation had already appeared. The omnibus, which is where we get the word bus from, was a long horse-drawn carriage, and it appeared around the 1820s as one of the earliest forms of public transportation and was used until the very early 20th century. Omnibuses did not have scheduled stops, and they would pick people up from the side of the road as long as a person flagged them down. Unlike buses today, which have, push buttons that you press on to get the driver to stop, the omnibus just had a string connected to the driver's ankle, which the passenger would push on when they wanted to get off of the bus. I imagine that was rather annoying. I would not have wanted to be an omnibus driver in the 1800s. Another form of transportation, which appeared shortly after in the 1840s, were the streetcars. These used railroad lines rather than unpaved roads, but they still consisted of a horse and carriage. I believe that's what we can see in the photograph here, because while the road was unpaved, there do appear to be railway lines on the street, and you can see the wheels of the trolley slot into those lines. Horses were still needed to pull it. New Bedford continued to use animals to move their streetcars in the late 19th century, at a time when much of the country was phasing out the use of animals in public transport. The decision to continue using animals was probably due in part to the time, money, and effort it would have taken to create ditches between the rails and under streets to install the mechanisms for cable cars. A few years after this photograph was taken, New Bedford started to install an electric system of trolleys, which connected to the electric poles and lines already set up and being set up in the city by the New Bedford Gas Company excuse me, and Edison Light Company. Some streetcars used animals, not electricity, in the city into the 1920s. The electric trolley system started to be phased out in the 1930s, and by 1947, it had been completely replaced with modern buses. Here we have another photograph taken by Clement I. Swift, this one dating to July 5th, 1889. The location of this photograph is not clear, but based on other photos taken by Swift in our collection, it's likely New Bedford or Acushnet. This photo is of the G.W. Bennett Blacksmith Shop, and the sign reads G.W. Bennett Horseshoer and Carriage Smith. As mentioned before, horses and carriages were still a very common mode of transportation in the United States at the time. Excuse me. One horse could pull a vehicle and riders or luggage weighing up to a ton. So it was necessary to have places to fix any issues that may arise and places to build carriages. This is like the precursor to the modern-day auto repair shop. In 1900, there were over 10,000 carriage builders in the United States. My apologies. This is clearly not one of the large factory manufacturers, but one of the small local blacksmith shops that could reshoe horses or fix carriages or build a new one. It is possible that G.W. Bennett made use of baleen, also called whalebone, in his shop, because it was sometimes used for carriage springs due to its pliable and springy nature. Baleen was also used for products like corset stays, skirt hoops, and the buggy whips which were used by carriage drivers. For blacksmiths, who saw much of the products they made in the early 1800s being made quicker and cheaper with machines with the rise of the industrialization in the later 1800s, moving to carriage repair and horseshoeing was a good way to keep their jobs and continue making money, because those things still had to be done by hand. They were not yet able to do that with machines. This next photograph, dating to around 1900, shows a woman posing with her dog. It looks like she's taught her dog to sit up and shake hands, and she is smiling, so she's definitely proud of her dog. I found many photographs in our collection of people taking photos with or of their pets, showing that as many things change, some things will always stay the same. As long as there's a camera around, someone is going to use it to take pictures of their pets. There seems to have been little written on dog training besides that for hunting dogs prior to the mid-1900s, but people were still doing it without written help, as evidenced by the photos that I found. Many of the dogs and cats in these photos may have been household helpers as well as pets, performing tasks like guarding property, herding livestock, and getting rid of rodents. Judging by the amount of photos of pets taken, they were clearly loved as members of the households. I even came across studio portraits from the 1850s and 1860s of children posing with their dogs, and sometimes just of the dogs themselves on pedestals. So they literally placed their pets on a pedestal, as we still do figuratively today. Skipping forward a bit in time from our previous transportation photographs, we reached 1905. This photograph is from the Prescott collection, where a few of the other photos in this presentation will come from. The Prescott family were a well-off family who lived in Bedford and Dartmouth, and we have their photo albums from the late 1800s through the 1940s. Unfortunately for us, they did not note what type of automobile this is, though I have been able to find that the style is a side entrance tonneau. If anyone here is an antique car expert, please let me know in the chat. While the type of car is unknown, the photograph does allow us to see that the people in it are wearing motoring clothes. Motoring clothes were a specific category of clothing worn by people who went for drives or worked on cars between about 1900 and 1920. Because most people who were able to afford cars at the time were wealthy, though some brands like Ford and Hudson made lower-priced cars, motoring clothing was advertised to the upper middle and upper classes. Manufacturers insisted that people needed a whole other wardrobe for motoring, and indeed, at a time when not all roads were paved and not all cars were fully enclosed, it was for the best interest of one's skin and clothing that they had proper coverings. It was entirely possible to spend about as much money on a motoring wardrobe as it was on your car itself. One of the most important pieces was the coat, as can be seen on the woman sitting at the front of the car. These were generally of heavyweight fabrics, except for summer ones, and these coats soon became fashionable and a status symbol, indicating that the wearer had enough money to afford a car. In 1905, the year this photo was taken, it was said that the fad of the moment was to dress as if one had just stepped from one's motor car. It also showed that the wearer embraced the newest technologies of the time. The women in the photo are also wearing scarves wrapped around their hats and hair, a necessary item in a motoring wardrobe. Some people also wore goggles while driving, and some women's hats were sold with dust shields, like a veil to protect their face. Women motorists, especially those driving to a hotel or to make social calls, would keep a change of accessories with them and stop by the road before their destination to to remove their motoring coats, replace dusty accessories, and change their shoes out of driving boots. By the time enclosed cars became more common, around 1920, there was no longer a need for motoring goggles, scarves, boots, and coats, and motoring clothes fell out of fashion. Pardon me for a moment. This photograph, taken in 1910, shows Purchase Street looking south from William Street. A trolley car can be seen as well as the sign for the store CF Wing. The store was named after Charles F. Wing, who was born in New Bedford in 1851. He was a whaler and a merchant, and opened a small shop in 1874 at 774 Purchase Street, which is next door to where Poor Farm is today. His shop did well enough that he had the building razed in 1887 and replaced it with a 4-story building in the same place. This department store was popular in the city for quite a long time and did not close until 1964. Early advertisements from the CF Wing Company touted the hoop skirts, real hair switches, sleighs at summer prices, ladies' under vests and drawers, parasols, and sun umbrellas for sale at the store. Other items the store sold over the years were carpets, furniture, and sporting goods. Purchase Street was the main shopping area in the city in the later 1800s, as business moved away from the waterfront a bit as whaling started to wane. This next photograph, also taken in 1910, is from the Prescott collection and shows a sailing party on a sloop in Bermuda. The clothing they are wearing might look too warm for what is likely summer weather, but the man's shirt and the woman's dress are very likely made of cotton, which helps to keep one cool. The woman's dress also has fancy lace cutouts, which added to the cooling factor. Unlike synthetic materials made with plastic, as we often wear today, only natural materials were available for clothing in the early 1900s, and these did not trap moisture and heat like the clothing made with plastic does. Another smart choice this woman was making was to bring a small collapsible camera with her, which had bellows to make it easily portable and storable. Her camera may be a Kodak, as they were the first company to develop flexible film that could be stored in small box-like cameras and then used to take photographs. It is possible that her camera is a folding Kodak Brownie, which were produced between 1904 and 1926. The Brownie cameras were inexpensive, introduced in 1900, which allowed people to take snapshots of memorable moments in their lives and made photography much more affordable to people. One didn't have to have a darkroom. They could send the film back to Kodak or to their local camera dealer to have it developed. The advent of portable box cameras was only about 20 years before this photograph was taken, similar to our relation to cell phone cameras. This next photo dates to 1913 and is also from the Prescott collection. It shows a woman named Lydia Stetson in an electric automobile. Electric automobiles were quite popular at the time, especially for wealthier people, as I assume Lydia was because she was friends with the Prescotts. Electric cars did not have a noise, smell, or need to change gears that gasoline cars had. They also did not need to be hand cranked to start. For these reasons, and because they were better at traveling shorter distances like in cities, they were often marketed to and associated with wealthy women. This photo is likely to commemorate Lydia's purchase of the car, because her hat, probably secured with only a few hat pins onto her updo and not held down with a scarf, would not stay on long during a drive. Her hat looks to be decorated with what is probably an ostrich feather. Wearing hats with feathers or even whole birds on them was fashionable at the time this photograph was taken and for a few decades prior. The popularity of this reached the point of birds becoming endangered because of millinery. For instance, in one season in the mid-1880s on the Cape, one person in the hat trade killed 40,000 terns. This continuing problem led two Boston socialites, Harriet Lawrence Hemingway and Minna B. Hall, to form the first Massachusetts Audubon Society in 1896, which helped organize the National Association of Audubon Societies in 1905. Lydia Stetson's decision to wear an ostrich feather may in fact have been influenced by the bird conservation movement, as women were encouraged to choose ostrich feathers because they could be gathered without killing the birds. This photograph was also taken by the Prescotts and shows what is almost certainly Barnum and Bailey's Circus, which was in New Bedford on June 13, 1914. At the time, the circus was run by the Ringling Brothers because they had purchased it after Bailey died in 1906. However, they would not combine the two circuses until 1919, so at the time of this photo, the circus was still known as Barnum and Bailey's. Earlier variants of circuses, dating to the 1800s, partially backed by Barnum, had much longer names, such as P.T. Barnum's Great Traveling Museum Menagerie Caravan and Hippodrome, or P.T. Barnum's Greatest Show on Earth, and the Great London Circus, Sanger's Royal British Menagerie, and the Grand International Allied Shows United, which was later shortened to Barnum and Bailey's Circus. Smaller cities would be chosen for the circus to visit, and they would hold free parades in the cities to entice people to pay for admission to the circus. Seeing elephants walk down the streets in New Bedford must have been a memorable experience, sure to draw people to the circus. It is likely that New Bedford got to see Jumbo the elephant in 1882 when he was displayed by Barnum and Bailey's Circus, as one of the first African elephants to be in the United States. In fact, Jumbo's name is where we get the term jumbo from, like for jumbo shrimp or jumbotron. The elephant certainly was in Fall River in 1882 on June 28th, and about 25% of the city's population came out to see him. The circus was in New Bedford 2 days prior, so it is very likely that they saw Jumbo as well. Perhaps some people who saw this parade in 1914 remember the 1882 parade. This photograph was taken just a month and a half before the assassination of Franz Ferdinand started the First World War. And that brings us to the aftermath of the war, with this photo from April 15th, 1919. It shows Washington Street in Boston decorated for a welcome home parade for the 26th Division. The 26th Infantry Division was based in Boston and consisted of units from New England. It was nicknamed the Yankee Division. They saw combat in France during the war. 1 million people came to the parade in Boston to welcome the 20,500 soldiers home. 2,000 Civil War veterans gathered at Commonwealth and Mass Ave to watch the parade. A similar parade in Philadelphia a year earlier for the Liberty Loan to support the war effort unfortunately caused an outbreak of the Spanish influenza among the city, which ended up being the hardest hit city in America. Massachusetts was not spared the devastation of the flu, and 12,000 soldiers in the state got the flu in September 1918. It soon spread throughout the state, hitting especially hard in heavily populated cities such as Boston. The flu did not end until a few months after this photograph was taken in June of 1919. This is a situation that is unfortunately familiar to us now. Let's move on to some lighter material, shall we? This photo from the Prescott collection shows Hester Prescott feeding a squirrel named Jumbo. The squirrel must have been fed by the Prescott family so much that they decided to name it. Perhaps the name is a nod to Jumbo the elephant, likely meant to be an amusing name for such a small animal like a squirrel. Perhaps Jumbo was even the Prescott's pet squirrel. While it is not very common today to keep squirrels as pets, they were much more popular in the, It is not very common today to keep squirrels as pets, and they were not as common as pets when this photo was taken. They were much more popular in the 1800s. Squirrels were kept as pets starting in the 1700s. Indeed, they were one of the most popular pets in colonial America. It was mostly American gray squirrels that were pets, though red squirrels and flying squirrels were also kept. Like one seen in John Singleton Copley's Portrait of a Boy with a Squirrel, now at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. By the 1800s, they were not just captured from the wild for pets, but were also sold in pet stores. An 1883 manual advised that one could purchase a squirrel from their local bird breeder. However, these squirrels are really only from wooded areas, and were not yet in city parks, which may be hard to imagine today. An unescaped pet squirrel climbed up a tree in New York City in 1856 and was such a novelty, or an unusual visitor, as one newspaper put it, that hundreds of people gathered to look at it. By the 1870s, cities started deliberately releasing squirrels in their parks in order to allow city residents to feel closer to nature and wildlife and be able to observe them for leisure and fun. In Boston and New Haven, the squirrels in the parks were so popular that people kept feeding them, and they soon grew so fat that they were falling out of the trees. Squirrel populations in city parks continued to be popular in the 1800s, and soon there were so many thousands of squirrels that there was little hope of ever reversing it, and that is why we see so many squirrels in parks today. Jumbo could have been a pet squirrel in 1919. Some people still kept squirrels as pets around this time, such as President Harding, who took office in 1922 and had a pet squirrel named Pete, who would attend press conferences and news briefings. Interestingly, President Truman also had a pet squirrel named Pete. Perhaps Hester saw the Squirrel Orchestra, a display of taxidermied squirrels playing tiny instruments that was on display in the window of a music store in New Bedford in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It was made around 1890 and was later given to the Millicent Library in Fairhaven, but unfortunately its current whereabouts are unknown. However, there is a photo of the squirrels on the library's website, and I highly recommend looking it up. This photograph is also from 1919 and from the Prescott collection. It shows a group of swimmers on a pier. The swimmers are wearing what was generally called bathing costumes, although the term swimming suit had been in use since about 1916, when the swimsuit company Janssen popularized it in order to sell tighter-fitting knit bathing suits. If they were associated with athletics and swimming, then they could be tighter-fitting, which would be less scandalous than people wearing them solely for leisure at the beach. Woolen and knit bathing suits are probably what the people in the photograph are wearing, and the use of stockings, as seen here, were not as common in bathing suits by the mid and late 1920s. Sorry. By the 1920s, many women's bathing suits no longer had short sleeves. They looked more like tank tops. The fabric used throughout the 1920s was generally knit or cotton, and as synthetic materials started to gain more popularity, they too were used in swimwear. Both synthetic and natural materials existed and were popular at the same times. For instance, I own two bathing suits from the 1930s, one made of wool and the other made partially of cotton and partially of a synthetic material called lastex, similar to spandex, both from the Janssen Swimwear Company. It is not actually uncomfortable to swim in knitted or cotton suits, and they are quite durable. At the time this photograph was taken, and into the 20s, the women had to be careful about wearing bathing suits that were too revealing of their legs, as they could still be arrested for public indecency if the bathing suits were too short. Now into the colder months. This photograph shows Hester Prescott with Seabury Stanton, his wife Jean Kellogg Stanton, and their daughter on the sled, Jean Stanton. The heavy fur coats for winter were common at this time, especially because synthetic materials were not as common and fur kept people very warm. They were also stylish, and coats like these showed off their wealth, and these people were quite wealthy. In fact, Seabury Stanton, who was born in New Bedford and was a son and grandson of whaling captains, became the treasurer for Hathaway Manufacturing Company in New Bedford in 1915, which at the time was a textile manufacturer that had been founded in 1839. Later, in 1955, the company merged with Berkshire Fine Spinning Associates to become Berkshire Hathaway, at that time the largest textile manufacturer in New England. Yes, that Berkshire Hathaway, the holding company run by Warren Buffett, has its roots here in New Bedford. Stanton was the president of Berkshire Hathaway, the textile manufacturer, by the 1950s. His brother Otis sold his shares in the company to Warren Buffett, done also in New Bedford at the Wamsutta Club in the 1960s. Warren Buffett's ownership of Berkshire Hathaway, resulting in its subsequent change from a textile manufacturer to the multi-billion-dollar holding company it is today, occurred because of Seabury Stanton. He wanted to buy back Warren Buffett's shares in the company and offered verbally to pay $11.50 to him per share. However, in the written offer Stanton gave him, it was listed as $11 and just under 40 cents. This annoyed Buffett, and so he decided to buy more of the stock instead of selling it back to Stanton, and this gave him control over the company. So the man in this photo tried to cheat Warren Buffett out of 10 cents per share, and it did not go over well. This photograph from slightly later in 1920 shows a diver coming up from construction on Dartmoor Bridge in Dartmouth, while workers and kids observe. The bridge shown here is likely the one built in 1901, which either replaced or was in a different location to the bridge that opened in 1836 and was a toll bridge until 1870, when the town of Dartmouth purchased it and made it a free causeway. In 1920, the town voted to build a new wooden draw on the bridge because the old one was unsafe. This must be the construction that is occurring in the photo. While we would today consider the diver's diving equipment old-fashioned, if this had been attempted 200 years prior, the diver may have used something called a diving engine, a leather-covered barrel which contained a limited amount of compressed air, and two armholes with watertight sleeves and a porthole of glass to see out of. By the time this diver was observing or assisting with the drawbridge construction, Fully independent diving suits with compressed air had been around for nearly 50 years, and cameras for underwater photography were already in use. This next photograph shows a filming location for the 1922 Hollywood film Down to the Sea in Ships. While the movie was made by Hollywood producers and actors, much of it was filmed in New Bedford, where this photo was taken. Both the camera crew and a set made to look like a cooper shop are visible. The silent film, about a Quaker whale ship owner and his daughter who wants to marry a man he does not want her to marry, was set in the mid-1800s in New Bedford and includes footage of real whaling. This was the second film that Clara Bow was in. She later became famous as the It Girl actress in both silent movies and talkies. The whaling ship Charles W. Morgan was used as a filming location for the cabin, deck, and forecastle scenes. The whaling bark Wanderer was used to film the actual whaling scenes and went out for a 2-month whaling voyage for the film from February 22nd to April 22nd, 1922. It was outfitted with a board reading Charles W. Morgan because that was the ship meant to feature in the movie, and this prop board is now in the collection of the museum. The Wanderer was the last whale ship to sail out of New Bedford on a whaling voyage, just 2 years after this movie was filmed. On April 25th, 1924, she sailed out on what was intended to be her last voyage, and on April 26th, she wrecked on the rocks outside Cuttyhunk, which really punctuated the end of the whaling era for New Bedford. Luckily, the crew survived. This photograph, from July 10th, 1922, shows the involvement of the local community in the filming of Down to the Sea in Ships. Hester Prescott and Carrie Stone are dressed in 19th century Quaker clothing because they were extras in scenes in the movie filmed in New Bedford. Some scenes were also filmed at the Uponiganset Friends Meeting House in Dartmouth, which was built in 1791. Members of the congregation, like the New Bedford extras, wore their grandparents' and great-grandparents' clothing to a church service for the film. The movie premiered at the Olympia Theater in New Bedford on September 25th, 1922, and began general distribution in 1923. We're going to jump ahead 10 years to the solar eclipse of August 31st, 1932. This photograph from the Prescott collection shows a group on the boat Kodak watching a total solar eclipse. This occurs when the Earth, Moon, and Sun align, and the Moon blocks the light of the Sun from reaching the Earth. The first photograph of a total eclipse was taken in 1851. The eclipse the Prescotts were watching in 1932 lasted for 1 minute and 45 seconds and was totally visible from the northeastern tip of Massachusetts and the Cape, which is very likely where they're watching it from. Notice that they're using eye protection to view the eclipse, which was not totally widespread at the time, nor were some of the methods used to do so safe. To watch an eclipse about 5 years prior to this photograph, some people watched through smoked glass, which was considered safe at the time but is now known to be ineffective. A photograph of people watching this same eclipse on August 31st, 1932, but watching from the top deck of the Empire State Building, shows some people looking through a protective film on glasses-shaped paper, similar to what the Prescotts are using, while some people look up with no eye protection. Hopefully, no one suffered serious eye damage, because while it is okay to look when the light is completely blotted out, it is a risk because if you look too early or too late, you risk looking at the intensified light of the sun and damaging your eyes. The Prescotts all seem to be taking safety measures to protect their eyes, though I imagine this photo was taken before the eclipse because it's still bright out. This photograph was taken a few years later on October 21st, 1936, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was giving a campaign speech to a large crowd in New Bedford. Here he was campaigning for his second term in office, and he won it in the following 2 elections as well, becoming the only president to ever hold more than 2 terms in office. He spoke to the crowd from the back seat of a motor car. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, maybe you can see my mouse here, that's her, she's seen standing in the crowd behind the car, wearing a hat and a coat with fur-trimmed collar. President and Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt paid a visit to the Delano family homestead in Fairhaven following this campaign speech in New Bedford. FDR's maternal grandfather, Warren Delano II, was born in New Bedford, and his great-grandfather, Warren Delano I, helped to found a whale oil refinery in Fairhaven. The second Warren Delano created Riverside Cemetery in Fairhaven, and he saved the cannons at Fort Phoenix from being purchased from an out-of-town buyer in 1893. The Delano homestead in Fairhaven was visited by FDR many times in his life and was where he announced his engagement to Eleanor to his mother, Sarah Ann Delano, after Thanksgiving dinner in 1903. Another connection FDR has to New Bedford, and to the museum more specifically, is the Resolute desk. One is, of course, in the White House, but another is in the Whaling Museum. The desk in the White House, unlike the desk at the museum, has privacy panels across the front to hide the legs of the desk's occupants. These were ordered by FDR in order to hide his wheelchair. So, the desk in the museum shows what the desk looked like originally when they were built in 1880. In this photograph of the aftermath of the 1938 hurricane, people stand on a bridge watching men trying to save a sailboat. The hurricane occurred on September 21st, and because technology like we have today to track and protect the path of storms did not exist, it caught the region off guard. The hurricane hit New England, Long Island, and parts of Canada, and caused about $15 million worth of damage, which today is about $250 million. $250 million. The people in the photograph were probably hoping that the sailboat was not destroyed, as over 2,600 boats were because of the hurricane. Another 3,000 were damaged. One ship to survive this hurricane was the Charles W. Morgan, the last surviving wooden whaling ship, which at the time was exhibited at Colonel Edward H.R. Green's estate in South Dartmouth. It stayed there until 1941, when it moved to Mystic Seaport, where it has stayed since, besides a brief return to New Bedford Harbor in 2014. Finally, just for fun, so we do not end on the heavy note of the hurricane, I want to share with you one of my favorite photos that I came across while preparing this exhibit. I'm not sure exactly the year the photo was taken, but I believe it was taken around 1909 because that's the year listed on the license plate. The car looks to be the 1909 Hudson Model 20 Roadster, which is the first year of production for Hudson cars. They were one of the first low-priced automobiles in America, and that first year they sold 4,000 cars. The note Sturtevant's Auto written on the photo indicates to me that the man pictured has the last name Sturtevant, and since having a car was not extremely common at the time, and he purchased a Hudson from the first year of production, he must have been very proud of his car, and local people very likely recognized it. However, the real reason that this photo is my favorite is not just because it shows a really neat looking car, but rather what I truly appreciate is the look on the dog's face. That dog is really cool and knows it. I hope you all enjoyed this tour through some of the wonderful photos to be found in the museum's photograph collection, and thank you so much for attending my talk.
Oh, thank you, Emma. Well done. So now I'm hoping that some of our viewers will have questions for you if they'd like clarification on anything. I know we had one comment from one of our coworkers wondering if it might be possible to get a photograph, a modern photograph of Purchase Street, to do a then and now version of the one that you showed earlier.
Well, that sounds really cool.
The Wing Company's business building.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's see, I can see some of the questions.
Question actually from your mother. How many photographs are in the museum's collection?
Well, that is a good question. I don't actually know. I'm not on the computer that has the database on it, but I imagine many, many thousands, perhaps even 100,000. I know we generally say that we have about 250,000 items in the collection, and I assume quite a lot of them are photographs.
We actually have more like 750,000 items in the collection.
Oh, wow.
But I mean, just the 48 collection alone, I think we have like 100,000 negatives or something like that. And not all of those are in photograph form, but they serve negative form. So that's quite a large collection.
Yes, it definitely is.
So I wonder if there's questions from anyone other than that one about the. Oh, okay. So there's a question here actually from Amanda McMullen, the museum's president and CEO. Thank you, Emma, for its photography as both art and documentation. When you think about right now, is there advice you have to capturing 2020 through photos? What would museum professionals at 50 or 100 years from now want to have?
That is a great question. I mean, I think the ones that I found most interesting were just people's everyday lives, like just doing stuff that you really enjoy, which is a lot of the things that we take pictures of on cell phones now. But I do think that it might be better to have those printed out because they're a lot sharper and they'll last a lot longer. One of the photos that I didn't end up including because I didn't have a lot of information on it, but it was the background for the very first slide, was two people on a seesaw in 1919. And I love that picture because the woman looks like she's falling off and she's like clutching her large hat and her mouth is open, but she looks like she's having a lot of fun. I just couldn't find very much info on the history of seesaws, so I didn't include it.
Yeah, and I would think too, like when I've gone through our photo archives, I really enjoy street scenes and just even though they seem like mundane photos, they provide a great context to life 100 years ago, 80 years ago. So, and it's nice to be able to compare then and now in terms of street corners and street scenes. So hopefully, well, I got people doing that.
Yes, definitely.
Our colleague here did, actually no, from Gail, she said photos like this could inspire a common ground story. And I know that our colleague Akia is collecting stories, photos, anything to document from anybody and everybody who wants to talk about their experiences in this region. So if they have old pictures that could help tell these stories, I know we'd love to have those.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
So we have a question here from Corey Gay. So this is a question from North Carolina. So nice job, Emma. I enjoyed learning about spring top hats and the history of squirrels in New Bedford. Did you come across any other photos of unusual pets?
Unusual pets. Not too many. It was mostly cats and dogs that I found. I did see a picture of a cat that was like sitting on a baby carriage, which made me think of the old stories of cats stealing babies' breath. So I feel like whoever took that might have posed it specifically for that. I didn't come across any really unusual pets, but I did come across one dog more than others, and that was the Prescott's pet schnauzer named McGregor. And there are like 15 or 20 years of photos of that dog. They really loved it, and they even sent out an invitation for tea, and they put a photo of the dog on it, and they said, McGregor requests your company for lunch, which is really great. But yeah, no unusual ones. Sorry, Corey.
Well, that's a long-lived dog if it was around for 15, 20 years.
Yeah, it was, definitely.
Perhaps that speaks to the health benefits of tea. Our colleague Akia asks, were you able to identify any of the unknown people or places in the images from your own research?
None of the people, but I was able to identify some of the dates that we didn't have written down. For instance, the parade in New Bedford, I ended up finding the circus routes for Barnum and Bailey's circus for that year because they'd only written down the year. So I was able to narrow down the date, as well as for the Eclipse, which I also think didn't have the date written on it. But none of the people know.
There's another comment from one of our colleague Jocelyn. I personally find it fascinating that their everyday lives back then is similar to ours, and that they wanted to photograph animals just like we do.
Yep, that was definitely something that I found.
Some things don't. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it was great. I mean, I think a lot of that was the invention of the small snapshot cameras, which really kind of led to what we do now, which is just taking photos all the time because we can, and I think it's great.
Yeah, processing time now is instantaneous.
Yes, it's certainly amazing.
And there's a
Yeah,
lot more work.
the snapshot cameras, the early ones, you had to like hold it on your chest and look down into the viewfinder to take pictures, and you could really only take them outside before they had invented flash. So we have it a lot easier now.
Oh, and I do want to mention that when you were showing that photo of, I think it was a 1909 photo of the people in the car, and the ladies had their hats and, you know, held on with scarves. One of the people who had tuned in said perhaps heritage museums could identify the car for you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
So that's a good idea to follow up with them, because, you know, they might know. All right. And I don't know that we have any other photographs. I'll ask you a question that I often ask when I'm judging at a science fair contest.
Sure.
I'll ask, while doing the research, what was the biggest surprise? So I'll ask you the same question.
Oh, that is a good question.
Squirrels falling out of trees.
I mean, that was pretty great. I don't know what the biggest surprise would be. I suppose just the amount of everyday photos that there are. I actually didn't really know how early the Brownie cameras, which were the first small ones, were available. So I think it's just fascinating that it really does stay the same. People brought them with them on vacations. I've seen photos from the Prescott family from Germany and Bermuda, and they just brought their little cameras with them everywhere. So I suppose that was the biggest thing that I was not aware of, was just how early people started doing that, which was around 1900.
So I want to let you know that we have people tuning in from Pittsburgh, Florida.
Oh, that'd be Abigail and
yes.
Hannah. Thank you so much for coming. I miss you both.
North Carolina. Yep. So, and then of course lots of local folks.
Excellent.
Oh, when did the museum receive the Prescott photo collection?
That's a good question. I think based on the accession date, it's 1981.
Okay. And how many photos in there?
Many, hundreds, maybe 300 or 500. It spans about 50 years.
Oh, okay. Question from Abigail. Please advise on how to domesticate squirrels. What do they eat? Can they be litter box trained?
That is a great question. So Abigail, while I was doing my research, I did find a little bit of info on keeping squirrels as pets. You have to make sure it's legal in your state first. And I guess they can be domesticated, but they only bond with one person. They don't like anybody else. So if you get a squirrel, it's your squirrel, and that's it. I didn't find anything about litter box training squirrels. I don't know if they do that. And I imagine they eat like nuts and food made for other small rodents, like for gerbils and hamsters.
Right. And one of our docents asks the question, and she says, "Great talk, Emma. I wonder were there any photos you were expected to find that you could not?"
That's a good question. I was actually not going into it expecting to find any certain kind of photos. I just wanted to take a look through our photo collection and see what I could find that was interesting. So I didn't really have anything that I was expecting to find.
Okay. Well, I believe that's all we have for questions. Our colleague Akia says, when I was at Notre Dame, the squirrels would approach us on muffin crumbs as we left the dining hall every morning.
That's great.
Yeah, and I can remember my first time walking through Central Park and the squirrels walking up to me as opposed to walking away. I was completely freaked out. It's like these animals are supposed to be afraid of people.
Definitely not the ones in the parks.
Nope, not at all. And I know you had an interesting squirrel experience on campus a couple of years ago.
Yes,
so
I did.
With the person walking across. All righty, well, I think thank you all for everybody who tuned in. Thank you. Appreciate it, Emma. Fantastic job. Very informative and very entertaining. And really just I'm going to use pardon the pun, a snapshot as to what exists in the Wheeling Museum's photo archives. So for those of you that are interested, if you go to our homepage and you go to the Explore tab or the Explore term on the homepage, you can explore collections, and in there you can explore our photo collections, and then you can pick a street name, you can pick a photographer's name. You never know what you're going to find. All righty, so I think.
Thank you, everybody.
And there's your notice of what's happening next.
Thank you. Good night.